So I've got a meeting.
So just to introduce myself, my name is Charlotte Burton. I'm the marketing manager for the Centre for Commercial Law Studies, and part of my job is to provide opportunities such as these for you as prospective students to find out a bit more about studying at CCLS and at Queen Mary. And the programme that we're looking at particularly today, as you can see on the slide, is energy and climate change law, or energy and natural resources law, as you can see here. So I've got my colleagues here, which are allowed to introduce themselves in a moment. But just before we start, just to say, if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them as we go along. You can use the Q&A or the chat function to do that. I will monitor these as we go through the presentation. And if there's anything very specific, I may answer that during the presentation. But if there's anything that's a bit broader, I might save that for some Q&A time at the end. So please don't worry if I haven't got to your question. It's just because I might be saving that for everyone to hear the answer for their benefit as well. So please don't worry, we will get through as much as we can. So we'll have presentation just now and then opportunity for questions at the end. But also just note that this session is being recorded. So if you've got work to get back to or anything, please do not worry, we will share this afterwards as well. But please do stay for the full session. It's always lovely to have everyone here. Okay, so Nora, James, I will pass over to you to introduce yourselves and go ahead with your presentation.
Lovely. Well, I'm James Dallas, and I am the Executive Director here at the Institute. And I should say, just following on from Charlotte's introduction, for which thank you. As far as I'm concerned, I'm very happy, and I'm sure Nora is, if you ask questions as we go along as well, if you want to. So I read law. I qualified back in 1979, a very, very different world indeed, and we'll touch a little bit on going back to the 70s. But I worked for a firm in the City of London and then joined International Energy Development Corporation, which was a client of Herbert Smith's, which they had set up. And behind it was a man called Maurice Strong. And the only reason I mention him is because although he was an oil and gas man, he ended up as chairman of Petro-Canada. He was also the chair of the UN convention in Stockholm in 1972, which was an incredibly important seminal event, really, in terms of human damage to the environment and people's recognition of that damage, although climate change was not then an issue. And he then went on to be chair of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which spawned the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, none of which I was aware of when I worked for him. But he was a remarkable man. Anyway, I went back into private practice at Denton Hall, spent my entire career in energy, and I've been with Queen Mary pretty much since the beginning of this specialism in energy, which was in 2014, and I joined shortly after. Nora.
Thanks, James. Yeah, just to echo James, we're very happy. Obviously, this is entirely geared towards you, the students, and answering any questions that you might have. So I'm very happy to take them at any time throughout the presentation. So I'm completely different to James, other than the fact that we both worked at Herbert Smith. I was actually in the dispute resolution department there, but we worked very closely hand in hand with the energy department because of the predominantly the dispute resolution provisions in most of the contractual arrangements you see, whether it's concessions or PSCs, production sharing agreements, tend to favor arbitration. So yes, I am the academic director of the Energy and Climate Change Law Institute here at CCLS. And I've actually been teaching at Queen Mary since 2002. As you can see there from the slide, I'm a public international lawyer by training, but over the past decades have, I suppose, specialized in international dispute resolution, in particular in relation to energy disputes, whether it's onshore or offshore, renewable or otherwise, also some mining disputes, coal disputes. So it's quite handy that a lot of the cases that I get to work on and sit as arbitrator, I can then strip away the details and use as examples in the classroom. Again, a bit like James, my career is a bit non-linear. I also left Ireland after qualifying and worked in asset-backed finance and securitization in Clifford Chance, and it's no experience is ever lost. It's always very useful to know how the money moves around the world. So that was quite interesting. I've worked for the oldest NGO in the world, which is Anti-Slavery International. And then I worked quite closely with probably one of the better known public international lawyers in Cambridge, Sir Eli Lauterpacht. So learned a lot from him. Quite intimidating to work for somebody who had nearly 50 years more experience than you in a specialized area. And yeah, so I'll hand back over to James. Welcome, everybody.
And as Nora said, actually, I mean, interesting, A, touching on your litigation experience, and B, on finance, because in the context of climate change and renewables and stuff that we may get onto in our discussion here, litigation is playing an extraordinarily important role in pushing governments to meet their commitments in relation to climate change. And finance is going to be fantastically important as we face the energy transition and need to put hands into deep pockets to be able to afford that transition. But anyway, I digress. The outline, what we're going to talk about today is tell you a little bit about what we do at the Energy Law Institute, and importantly, what you can expect from your LLM. So we'll talk a little bit about the modules that we cover and some of them, the academic part of it, but also what other activities and events and arrangements we put in place to enhance the experience for your LLM. We're very lucky being based here in London. We'll talk about that. And because we want this to be a very rounded and full experience, and I think it is, and for it to be fun. So it is, as we said, an opportunity for you to ask questions, so please do. We'll just have a look at first, I think, really what makes an LLM and our course special. And really, you distill it all up, there's probably three things. One is simply the dynamism of the energy sector, which is reflected in the modules that we cover. Secondly, our location here in London. We're very lucky to be based here in London because it's a very important centre for all kinds of reasons, which we'll touch on, and the geography, which Charlotte briefly touched on in the introduction. And we'll look at each of those. And I'll start by just talking about the dynamism of the sector. If you want to flick to the next slide, if it's available, maybe. Does it want to go to the next slide?
It's moving on my screen. Is it not moving for you, James? No.
No.
Okay. Let me just. That's the. I mean, the downside of technology.
I'll talk to it generally anyway. I mean,
is this one?
It's just not doing it for whatever reason.
Can you try now, Nora? Clicking it. There we go.
Oh, there.
There.
This one or the one before?
And really, the point about the sector, and you know, I've been involved with the energy sector, as I said, really since 1979, 1980, when I qualified and went straight into the corporate department of Herbert Smith at a time when they were involved with the government's plan to nationalise all of the licenses in the North Sea. Not many people go back that far and remember it, but anyway, the thing about the sector is, as somebody put very well the other day, it's 8% of the global economy, but it's the first 8%. It's incredibly influential in lots of ways. It's essential, obviously, to industry and the economy. It's very political. There are wars that have been fought over it and wars that have been won because of access to it. The finance is at a level which you won't really see in any other business activity. And when we come on to energy transition, it's going to require incredible amounts of money. I mean, telephone numbers of money. It's always been at the forefront of technology and technological advancement, and it's also environmentally very significant. Historically, with oil spills, you will have seen things like BP Macondo and other terrible events that occur going all the way back to Piper Alpha and so on. But now the most important, significant being the environmental impact on our climate. And climate change is creating a revolution in the sector. It's changing the players, either the players, new players are coming in, or old players, the big oil companies, are trying to rebadge themselves as very green and focus their businesses on renewables. There are new technologies being developed all the time at high speed and deployed very quickly because of the urgency of it all. Financing is changing as well. There's green finance coming in, and it's affecting the way that we live. And if I go back to 1972, and I mentioned the convention in Stockholm, where they were really concerned about the consumptive habits of humans and how we were going to change, how we were changing the earth. The real concern there was about exhausting natural resources. And in relation to oil and gas, they felt that we would run out by the turn of the millennium. Of course, now we've discovered so many more and unconventional that actually the issue is now about leaving it in the ground, because burning fossil fuels is having such a detrimental effect. And interestingly, the other thing that is worth noting is that the population of the world then, which was noted as a sort of concern because humans were consuming so much of the natural resources of the world, the size of the world then was 3.8 billion people, and we're now at 8.1 billion. So these are things which have a huge and marked effect on the sector, but it is the most dynamic of all the business environments, and it's constantly changing, and now is the most interesting time of all, I think. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Nora to talk about what we offer outside of the pure modules.
Yeah, just actually to add on to what James said, just to give an idea of some of what they call the super majors, or kind of bigger, better known international oil companies. So Statoil changed its name to Equinor to sound, I suppose, more aligned with its outlook, and they're all trying to pivot. I mean, BP are all trying to move towards further investment in renewables. So I think that that's a really good example. And then, of course, Dong, that used to be the Danish oil and gas company, changed its name to Ørsted, which I think is the name of a Danish, maybe 17th century scientist. So they're all changing their, I suppose, their public persona to try and align with the movement in the market. And I think that that's one of the themes that will run through all of the modules that you'll be studying here with us in Queen Mary. I'm hoping that that slide moved. I have no idea why the tech isn't working for me today. I've used Zoom the entire way throughout COVID when we were no longer able to go to the building in London. And speaking of London, it is a great location, not just because James and I both worked in the City of London in Herbert Smith and in Dentons, and Clifford Chance for me also. But we also have a lot of contacts in London, both with law firms and with energy companies. And actually the government, we've had speakers come in from, I keep calling it DEC. I know it's not DEC anymore. There's lots of new energy departments that have been set up in the UK government.
3 times.
Yeah, exactly. It's changed to BEIS, and now actually have a dedicated energy unit department looking at the transition in particular. So that helps us. So things like we have the annual Clifford Chance lecture. That's sponsored by Clifford Chance. We've had some phenomenal speakers at that. It's an annual event. We've had hundreds of people travel to attend it, and students, of course, are always invited. So it's a nice way to get to meet a wider, I suppose, number of players in the market from various backgrounds, whether it's nuclear, renewables, or the more kind of conventional oil and gas companies. So that helps. And we do run regular events. We have what we used to call the Friday lecture series, which is now Thursday because COVID killed Fridays. So where we get different voices in. So we have 2 each semester. Sometimes we have an NGO come in, or a climate activist, or we've had in-house counsel from EDF, the French energy company, Shell, BP, to talk about a topical issue in the energy sector at that time. So we're constantly making sure that students are exposed to not just James and my voices and other people who teach on our staff, but also to what's actually happening in the market. We also have an energy forum, which again is kind of like designed to be, I suppose, if you will, to make us look like a thought leader, where we again address changes in the market. And we've looked at funding for nuclear, which has been, especially for one-off nuclear power plants like Hinkley Point C, has been a concern. We have had economists. We've looked at the LNG markets, the shift in the market and how it's become much more fungible now that there's actually a kind of a global trade in liquid natural gas. So again, very topical issues and a good opportunity for students to attend, listen to the debate, and actually contribute to the debate. Although we do also have one a year dedicated to the students, student voices. We get some alumni, just so you get a chance to hear, about life after, potential, where do our students end up working after they have finished their masters with us here. Other things that we try and organize are, sometimes there's one-off events with some of our member law firms. You see them listed there. Obviously includes Herbert Smith, Claver Chance, Linklaters, Norton Rose Fulbright, and some of the chambers. We have some really good events. Again, usually on something topical. We had a debate, as an example, post the Paris Agreement 2015, old-fashioned debate as to whether or not the Paris Agreement went far enough, for and against, discussions followed by drinks. So we have a kind of a range of activities in addition to the regular classes that are taught each week, and in some circumstances, depending on the size of the class, if there be tutorials as well. So we do try and encourage through the student reps. So each year there's an energy student rep that's appointed to try and do some fun activities. We used to in the past go up and visit the nuclear power plant outside Edinburgh that's run by EDF. So they give you a kind of a couple of hour tour around the power plant, which is actually really interesting because you get to go into the huge, massive reactor room. Other years have gone down to do a trip out onto near Brighton, offshore wind farm. So they get a guided kind of explanation as to how it all works, how the power is linked up to the national grid onshore. So I think this year students are planning to do that mid next week. So quite a range of activities, as I say, hopefully designed to be as fun and entertaining as possible, including the learning. That is our aim in any event.
Yeah,
James, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything onto that.
Well, just, I think that's a very good summary of it all. And it's a great opportunity, particularly with our member firms, but it's not just them. I mean, to rub shoulders with lawyers who made a career in private practice in energy and other lawyers in London who are working, who will be a few years further on in their careers, and to make contact with them and see how their careers have developed, and hopefully that leads to opportunities for some of our students. And it's interesting, actually, amongst them, we've now got, having started in 2014, we've got our first students sort of coming through to partnership if they went into private practice. We've got a partner at Norton Rose, who was one of the early scholars with us, which is who was actually chaired the panel discussion we had the other day. But we've got White & Case doing a session for us soon on LNG. We've got Ashurst doing one on drafting and so on. So they're really worth attending outside of the sort of formal module work, because real opportunities to, as I say, rub shoulders with other lawyers and find out what they're up to. Yeah, and we're really lucky actually that we can source like the experts in the field. As an example, we have Professor Paul Deemer. He's a visiting professor with us at the Energy and Climate Change Law Institute, and he was also co-chair of the committee at the AIEN. It used to be the AIPN, the Association of International Petroleum, but now Energy Negotiators, a very big global organization in the kind of standardization of upstream contracts. And he came and spoke about the revised model JOA, which is the Joint Operating Agreement, and was able to give a very clear and precise explanation as to why some of the newer provisions were included, in particular in relation to human rights and environment. So that was really interesting to get kind of the background on that. And one of the things actually that I didn't mention is, sorry, the Lord Browne Dissertation Prize. Sorry, James, go. No, but it is about being in London, and because you've got such a concentration of expertise that you can draw on it very quickly. Yeah,
Yeah.
Lord Brown Essay Prize. He was
Yeah,
he,
well, it's actually for the dissertation. So all energy related dissertations that are submitted by students are, depending on the grade, are then shortlisted, and we select several and send them to Lord Brown. I'm not sure if you're probably too young to remember Lord Brown, but he was the CEO of BP and quite an innovator actually at the time, and really pushed BP, as he probably would argue. I think I've heard him say it in the Clifford Chance lecture, sooner than was the market was ready for, tried to diversify into renewables, and also was very proactive in relation to transparency. So they were involved in Mongolia BP, and there was a lot of the NGOs, including Transparency International, were saying, well, this is all very secretive. We don't know what payments are going to be made to the government. And he said, no problem, I'll tell you. And of course, the Angolan government said, actually, if you do, we'll cancel your concession. So, but he was very progressive for his time, James.
Yeah, he was. And you're absolutely right. In a way, BP, some of you may remember at some stage, they wanted their slogan BP was labeled as beyond petroleum. He was looking beyond petroleum to renewables and the energy transition, but at a time when there wasn't quite enough, I think, capacity in the renewables market to absorb everything that he had done in oil and gas. But he's very innovative, and he's still closely involved with us, obviously through the Essay Prize and otherwise, and we're very lucky to have him involved.
Yeah, he's been very generous. I can never remember the figure because he's actually increased it. So, but it's not an insignificant amount.
Last year,
first, second, and third prize.
£1,400, I think, for first prize, and something like 1,000 for second, and 500 for third. I mean, that's well worth it.
Well, it's great seeing as you have to submit.
To do it anyway, exactly.
You have to. Yeah, we made it mandatory. We'll talk about that in a while.
And the other point that is really worth making about the LLM, and it's a point that Charlotte made earlier, which is that we attract students from all over the world. I think in the short time we've been around, we've had representatives from something like 80 countries and 5 continents. And not only is it very geographically dispersed, but also the backgrounds of the individuals are very different. So some, maybe 20%, 25% come on from a first degree, but the other 75, 80% will have worked somewhere previously, sometimes for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, sometimes for as long as 15 plus years, and in ministries, regulators, for NGOs and so on. So they all bring enormous wealth of experience, and you'll learn an awful lot from the debate that takes place within the classroom between your fellow students, as well as learning from us.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that. I start off the year by saying to the students at the Energy Fundamentals, which is a kind of a 2-day dedicated program for all our energy students, and actually open to anybody taking energy modules, but usually it's the specialism students that attend. We more or less say it's mandatory. So we cover, I suppose, the energy value chain in that 2-day fundamentals course. But I say to them, yes, you'll learn a lot from the team here at the Energy and Climate Change Law Institute, but you also learn a huge amount from each other, different perspectives. Some years we had a couple of students that were sponsored by Pemex, which is the Mexican state-owned energy company, and they've been involved in energy. Well, they expropriated the entire sector back in the 1920s, so they have a very long history. But it was very interesting that they wanted to send these students from Mexico that were familiar with just one part of the energy sector, and they wanted to learn about renewables, nuclear, energy and climate change law. So they wanted to have them kind of a wider wealth of experience. So I think that's quite an important aspect. You will definitely learn from each other.
I think that's absolutely right. And again, looking at how global the nature, both in the conventional upstream, how global it is, but also the global problem of climate change and how people are tackling that in different countries, means that it's very important to have access to the different solutions that are being put forward in different countries to address the common problems of emissions mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And so I think in a way, the diversity is even more important. And then the other thing is it creates really a long-term network for you. And our students do keep in touch with one another, just as they do return to give lectures and take part in panel and conferences and so on. And so you've got a ready-made network, which I think is very valuable. So I think that's probably us on.
Yeah, and it's actually super Timor-Leste. Sorry, James. Yeah, so for us, so students from Patagonia, Timor-Leste, Chile, Uruguay, obviously definitely across Europe, but and Southeast Asia. So really, really interesting for us. And I think that the fact that we have a really good mix of the majority having had work experience in the past, that also contributes a lot to the discussion and debate in class. Based on their experience. So we've had students who'd worked in renewable energy projects or in financing, so they understand and can bring different experiences into the classroom. I'm hoping that has moved, and Charlotte says yes, so I'm good to go.
Yep.
Just before we look at some of the modules, just in general, some information, you may already have looked at this online, but in order to graduate with your LLM in energy and climate change, you need 180 credits in total. To get the specialism, 120 of those
you're slightly
credits have to be from.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So okay, can you hear me now?
I don't know if it did.
I haven't moved at all.
Did that break up a bit? Did you? No.
A little bit, but sounds clear
It's
enough.
fine. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was going to say I can turn off my video, but actually you might lose then the slides. So
Yeah.
anyway, you have to choose between 15 and 13 credit modules, 120 from the energy specialism. James and I, in our infinite wisdom, and also based on the fact that we've interviewed many people over the last 20 or 30 years, it was a good idea for LLM students to do a 10,000 word dissertation. So it's mandatory. So you must do that 30 credits dissertation, because for us, we felt that if you were recruiting, you would expect somebody from a common law jurisdiction to have done some long, independent, detailed research. So that's one of the reasons why we kept it. And students do produce quite good dissertations and have actually never had to do anything of length. So they've either done just all exams or they've done shorter papers of 1,500, maybe 2,000 words. So I think it is a good exercise to go through. And of course, you do get a supervisor allocated to you to help you through that process. So you're not kind of doing it on your own if you've never had to prepare one before. And then you have a little bit of leeway. You have 30 credits that you can pick outside the specialism. So maybe something in public international law or human rights or humanitarian law. I'm picking subjects that I used to teach or have taught in the past. But there's things like IP, TMT. So there's a range of options that you can choose from. I mean, there is also an informal way for you to be able to audit some modules if you wanted to. I think you just have to get the approval of the person who's running the module, and obviously space, if the classroom is too small, that might be an issue. But usually it works out that if students do want to audit, then they can. That just means you sit in on the class, you have access to the materials on QM+, which is our online platform at Queen Mary, but you just don't have to do the assessment. So that's quite a useful thing to be able to do. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry, James.
Well, I was just going to say quite a lot of there were quite a number auditing on the renewables this year. So yeah.
All right, that's good. And there was a few on energy and climate change law, and I had several on energy law principles who were doing commercial law and wanted to come in and understand the contracts and how they were meant to work in energy law.
And that actually is also valuable in the debates that take place, if you like, within the classroom, because you've got people doing different specialisms, coming at subjects with a slightly different slant to it.
Yeah, I'm loath to just run through a whole big long list. These are just some select modules, some of which we would consider to be, I suppose, core modules to the energy specialism. But does any of the student or potential students who are online, are they particularly interested in hearing about one over the other, rather than us running through whatever, 8 or 10 odd.
And see if anyone in the chat is, but maybe we can just start, pick one that seems to be popular as a basis.
Yeah, okay, well, I will then start with the energy law principles as it's the top of the page there. So this module actually has run, it'll be in it, we're actually going to be 10 years old, the whole decade, James, this academic year in September 2024. So that module has run since the beginning. In its previous iteration back in 2014, it was called International Energy Transactions and was a longer module, but a couple of years ago, college went through a process where they were wanting it to be not 22.5, but 15 or 30 credits. So energy law principles really focuses in on the energy market drivers, sets out all the terminology, and then deals with the really important contracts in the upstream sector. So the various types of concession agreements, the production sharing agreements, licensing. How is that done? It uses some examples from Nigeria. I actually have students, because I've looked at this area a lot, I actually allocate various agreements to students and we discuss various provisions in them, how they're meant to work, and then and how they're interpreted by tribunals if they ultimately end up in dispute. So it's quite a practical look at contractual provisions, which, yes, I mean, it's very hard to make contract provisions that are sometimes quite densely worded fun, but it is actually a very important and kind of, I suppose, core module. It also looks at, again, that shift, that energy transition, because we can't really have a module, even if it's dealing with the conventional side of the oil and gas sector or the energy sector. You need to know how that's impacting on the conventional sector. And then we look at the joint operation agreement, which again is kind of, I call it the marriage certificate of how competitors come together and run on a day-to-day basis an upstream oil and gas project. And it is quite, I suppose, unique provision to the energy sector, because as an example, my dad worked for Guinness Group Ireland for many, many, many years. And if I came home with a tin of Murphy's, which would be the competitor, or Heineken, he would take it out of the fridge and put it outside. So there's no way that the competitors in the drinks industry or in the sugar industry would ever come together in a contract and agree to work together and put money into a pot together. And then if they do find oil and gas, to share on the profit is quite an important feature of the upstream sector. I think the only equivalent I've ever come across is movies. So the movies are so hard to get the funding for that they do get quite a lot of collaboration between what would be essentially competitors. So they're the kind of the main contractual provisions that we look at in those energy law principles. And I think it's fair to say both James and I, as we're practitioners, I have nearly over 25 years experience, we come at it from a very practical point of view. So yes, we obviously teach you the theoretical background, but really we're looking at what is a contract provision, what is the force majeure clause, why is it important, why is it in every single energy contract, what is the significance, and how is it interpreted? So you really get to see it's more practically focused module.
Yeah,
James, I'll hand over to you. Just wait, somebody's asked a particular module.
International energy transactions, Samuel said, looks interesting.
Yes, now unfortunately that's one that hasn't run. So as I explained 10 years ago, energy law principles and international energy transactions were all, they were one module, so it covered everything. It may be something after I was at a staff meeting yesterday that they might be considering bringing back slightly longer modules that cover all of the core material. So international energy transactions actually isn't working this year. I didn't notice it was on the slide, but it kind of covers specific areas. So it did in the past also look at the JOA, because a lot of people who took energy transactions hadn't done energy law principles. And then it looked at the nuclear energy, LNG, sale purchase agreements, project financing. So how are the finances put together for a project when you don't have an asset in the middle of it? It's very easy to get funding if you have, you know, a ship or a rolling stock for the railways. But at the very beginning of the project, you just basically have an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. So we go into a lot of detail in the energy transactions, international energy transactions module on the project finance. So it looked at very specific areas of the energy sector.
Yeah, and it's fair to say,
module?
well, just on that, project finance is also Nora mentioned, that one of the things we introduced quite early on was the Energy Fundamentals course, and it's just a 2-day course with 6 to 8 lectures, which ensure that everybody who's doing the specialism has a reasonable grounding across the board, understands the nomenclature, the sort of terms that we use, irrespective of which of the different modules they may choose to pick. And in that, one of the things we deal with is gas and LNG, and we also deal with project finance. Project finance also comes up in renewables and in climate change. So they get, there are a number of ways in which the project finance gets covered. Gas also gets covered. So a lot of the things that were previously in international energy transactions have also been divvied out elsewhere.
I'm just waiting to see if there any other particular module that people might want to hear about.
Do you want to?
So someone's asked, why is EU energy law not mandatory? I guess to give people choice.
Why is EU energy law?
Yeah.
Sorry, so what we did here is we selected, we didn't put up all of the modules that are available.
This was just to give you a flavour of the types of modules that are available. They're some of the most popular ones. So obviously, of late, we've introduced, for example, 2 new ones. So it would have been more heavily dominated even just 10 years ago by upstream oil and gas and by nuclear, actually existing conventional, upstream oil and gas and energy. We introduced energy and climate change law, which we could talk about, and also renewables energy law, because they were of growing importance. And with recent events over the last, as you will have seen over the last few years, are going to play a really fundamental role in the sector. So, but none of these is mandatory, because people have different requirements, and they may already be working for an oil company and specifically want to move into the negotiation team for upstream oil and gas concessions or whatever it might be. They would want to be, they will choose their modules accordingly. Very few of them, it's fair to say, if they have a future in energy, will not have to understand something about climate change law and its impact on business, but none of these is mandatory. People can choose depending upon what their particular likes, dislikes, and needs are.
Yeah, just on that, actually. So the module that Professor Silke Goldberg, who's a friend of mine from Herbert Smith, runs at the moment, are current issues in energy regulation. So Silke is actually, she is the leading expert in the field, and she writes the book on energy regulation on all the European countries every year and updates it. So she's literally like a walking encyclopedia for regulation. And although the current issues, although they're looking at current issues, she does look very much at the EU regulation in there, because obviously that whole unbundling, the EU was essentially a market leader in, I suppose, trying to encourage competition and making sure that somebody wasn't producing, transmitting, and selling on to the end users and the power. For next year, and actually, James, I think I'm correct on this, that Silke will actually be running an electricity law module, which actually looks at how is the electricity market, the power market itself, regulated, what laws apply, and a bit on interconnectors as well. So it's a totally new module, and we expect it to be quite popular, because obviously that's something that a lot of jurisdictions globally will be looking at. Did you want to say a little bit about energy and climate change, James? Or
yeah, I'm very happy to. Again, this is one of the new ones for all kinds of reasons, which you'll be well aware of. It's becoming increasingly important. We started about 4 years ago, I think, with and Nora and I teach it, a 15 credit module, which is over 5 weeks, and we're now have extended it to a 30 credit module, and it's assessed with a 7,000 word essay. And really, you can't fully understand what's happening in the energy market without understanding what's happening in the climate change arena. It's been described by many as the defining issue of our age. Obama said we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it. And if you look at what happened at COP28 and where we are with the targets to reduce emissions in order to keep the increase in global average temperatures to below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and if we can 1.5, we really have an enormous amount to do. If you went back 15, 20 years, there would have been a debate about whether the scientists were right. That seems to have disappeared. If you look at the latest IPCC report, it's unequivocal that humans are responsible for changing the climate. And really, for me, the law in this area, it plays a fundamental role. There are lots of things we can all do to make a difference. We can change our diets and we can change the way we travel, not that a lot of people have done yet. And there are many other things we can do. But the truth is, the big changes will come about as a result of government policies, and government policies implemented through laws that will prohibit things or discourage things, and laws that will support and encourage the shift to new forms of low carbon technology. And so it's a really, really important area. And courts, of course, will play a very important role in enforcing obligations and rights. And we've seen, and I mentioned earlier when Nora was talking about her litigation background, just how important litigation is becoming in this area in holding government's feet to the fire. There's a very seminal case in Holland in which the Dutch government was taken to court for having not done enough to meet its international commitments under the Paris Agreement, and there are others that are following suit. So in terms of what we cover, we start by looking at the science, so you'll get an understanding of the science, which, as I say now, is less debated. You'll get an understanding of the different players in it. Clearly, there's a big debate about the developed world versus the developing and who's most responsible for climate change, but also who has the resources to do most about it. But there are much, much more subtle gradations. And of course, there are issues, intergenerational issues about who should bear the cost and brunt of having to make the changes to a low carbon economy, and even debates about, humans versus other parts of the animal kingdom. We look at the particular challenge that it poses for public international law. We look at the public international law treaties going back to Stockholm, which we touched on, all the way through to then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which in due course led to something called the Paris Agreement, which some of you may be aware of. And it's the Paris Agreement commitment, or at least goal, of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which was set then, and all countries were required to come up with their own plans as to how they were going to seek to reduce their emissions to meet that target. So not imposed from on high, but encouraging them to produce ambitious targets. So we look at all of that, and we look at what progress has been made, and we look at the various COPs, which are the meetings of the parties to the UNFCCC, the most recent one being COP28, which made it very clear that we're not on course. A lot has been done, but not enough, and a real challenge getting through to the early 2030 targets, which involve, amongst other things, a tripling of the amount of capacity in renewables. That's power from things like wind and solar, not just those, but I mean, a massive program, which will have very significant implications. And that also obviously gets covered in renewables. And we look at the financing, we look at the litigation, which we've talked about, and look at the implications for the oil companies themselves. As Nora was saying, they're all having to consider what their future is and at what stage they will find themselves unable to either raise the finance to explore further, or indeed will find that there are prohibitions on further exploration. And that time will come, and we will be leaving fossil fuels in the ground. So it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's affecting the sector very considerably. It's a really interesting module. Even with 30 credits, we really run out of time, and I think it's been very, very popular.
Yeah, it's a really fun module, I have to say. It's probably my favorite module of the whole academic year. And actually, the reason behind it being moved from 15 to 30 was based on student feedback. So rest assured that we do try and take on board feedback that we get every year from students to try and make sure that you have the most positive experience, academic experience over the year LLM. But that was because students wanted to have a more time in the classroom to be able to discuss certain issues and approaches. Why was it taking so long? Why is it such a difficult and tractable issue? Why can't globally they reach consensus? And then more on the specifics where, we get students, as an example, this year, we had them pick a case from the climatechart.com website, any case that they're choosing, whether or not it had been decided or whether it was still pending, because it gave a real flavor to everybody in the room, including James and I, because obviously I picked some for the purposes of the lecture, but they picked other cases that I hadn't necessarily come across, because now we have thousands and thousands of climate-related cases globally, and that was really interesting. So it's a really fun module.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, just on that, it's a really good point that it's we've been explaining what we teach in it, but pretty much every lecture will have a lot of interactive input from the students, and we do quite fun things. So we in renewables, for example, we had negotiations between groups where they were given certain key issues that were outstanding in a contract, a renewables contract, and they had to negotiate them. And then there was a sort of panel, an arbitral panel that would amongst the students who decided how they should have resolved the outstanding issues if they hadn't resolved them. Anyway, it was incredibly popular. In the climate change one, we also did things like getting everybody to go away and look at their own country's nationally determined contributions to understand not only what was happening in their own countries, but actually they could choose the countries they wanted to do it from, but most chose their own. But then also they got a flavor of how other countries were doing it and the comparative aspects to it. So
Samuel, it's a really good
you're
question.
not just being talked at, is my point.
Yeah, it's a really good question on renewable energy being accessed by vulnerable communities, poor people and people with disabilities, and probably indigenous populations. So we don't have one specific dedicated module that just looks at access by vulnerable communities. There is a climate change law module that's run by the School of Law that looks at climate refugees. It does have, I think, an element of indigenous populations in there, but they don't look at climate change from an energy perspective. So our module, and when we were designing it, we were discussing with them because we didn't want to have too much overlap. Yes, obviously they deal with the treaties, but ours is entirely focused around the impact of the energy transition on the energy sector in particular. James does have renewable energy law module that he's just finished just a couple of weeks ago, but it looks more at how the projects are put together, what type of renewable power, what type of agreements. I think he also did a financing in that, you mentioned, James, as well.
Yes, he did, yeah. But then the other thing that's worth mentioning is where these modules are assessed by an essay, you get the chance. So if there is a topic you're particularly interested in, and it's not directly covered, but is within the general remit of the module, then you can write your essay on it, because you have the freedom to choose your essay title. It needs to be approved by the module convener, but that allows you, if there's a real area that you want to do more research into, to do that as well. Yeah, but the renewables one was again very interesting, looking at, I mean, out of the last COP meeting came a commitment to, or at least a pledge, as they put it, to triple the amount of renewables power capacity by 2030. Now, bear in mind that's 6 years away. It is a huge undertaking, not just in terms of getting projects up and running by then. They will actually have to build new factories to build the components for wind farms and so on, because there just isn't the capacity to go from whatever it is, 500 gigawatts to 1,500 gigawatts of power. I mean, by the way, so if you take Hinkley Point, which is a new power station, nuclear power station, one of the biggest power stations in the world being built at the moment, that's 3.2 gigawatts. We are talking here about another 1,000 gigawatts of power. So all in the next 6 years. So, but that's what we tend, so we're looking at the commercial aspects, what kind of contracts and how they differ from conventional power purchase agreements and so on, how it's going to be financed, what the technologies are, what issues they bring.
And Simon, just to finally to answer that question also, you could obviously, if you preferred, choose it as a dissertation topic. The only thing I would add to James's comments is that it is an LLM, so obviously the focus has to be primarily on the law, and the issue around energy and energy-related topics, including accessibility, and we do spend quite a lot of time in many modules talking about the energy trilemma, which is energy security, so long-term stable supply, environmental, so can it be produced in a sustainable way, and then of course access and affordability. So that concept of access and being able to access it does come up for discussion, but your focus, if you're writing a paper or a dissertation, has to be legal and not just policy.
Absolutely.
Charlotte, I see there's a question there for you to answer.
Yeah, I don't know if it's something that I don't know too much about the LLM and the PhD relationship, to be honest. I don't know if you guys do, but we've only got a couple of minutes. So
okay, yeah. So with regard to obviously there's no connection. So they're two totally different programs. They're independent. What I would say is that it would, if you are considering doing a PhD, it definitely will be useful if you get a distinction in your LLM dissertation, because that will indicate, because the way it works in Queen Mary is you apply for your PhD, you put in your proposal, they look at it, first of all, the office, PhD office says, do you meet the minimum requirements? And one of them is obviously look at the grades of your LLM dissertation, and then they send it on to potential supervisors depending on the area that you've chosen. So there's no direct correlation, but for sure your overall grades at the end, and in particular your LLM dissertation, will probably dictate whether or not you get it accepted on the PhD program at Queen Mary. And bear in mind that there is also sometimes funding available through Queen Mary, and I think it closes quite early. I think it's either January of each year.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you.
Final question. It varies from year to year, Panika. So some years we could have a very small percentage, and some years we'd have more. We do not grade on the curve like in America. So it just really depends. It depends on the year.
Yeah.
For anyone that was wondering, it was the percentage of distinctions that were awarded for students. So was the question.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. We have. What's that, James? I'm
Another
aware we've got a minute left, and I don't
Yeah.
want to take up people's time over longer than they need. So I might just close us off there, if that's okay. Are we okay to finish up, or was there something we really wanted to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, and the only other thing is, if people had further questions they want to put to us,
Yeah.
I'm sure Nora and certainly I would be very happy for you to drop us an email if there's any clarification you need, or you want to pick up the telephone or anything. We're
Of course. Nora, do you just want to click through a couple of slides? I think there might be just one at the end which has got some contact details on. The one after this, maybe?
I thought this was. I think this is the.
just to check
Oh.
if there was any there.
Yeah, no, they're just
no,
up
that
with
was it.
various links. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions, I'm just going to pop in the chat now our inquiries inbox, which comes to myself and my colleagues, and we're very happy to share those emails with James and Nora if you have anything very specific. James, Nora, thank you so much for your time today. Always really interesting when I joined the Energy and Climate Change program, because we find out lots of detailed information. It's all very topical. So thank you so much for your time. It's always very much appreciated.
And thank you for your patience on the technical side.
No
Yeah.
worries at all. That's
We
what
hope
I'm
to
here
see-
for.
We hope to see a whole lot of you in September.
I'm sure. I know we have many offer holders and inquirers here, so I'm sure we'll see some of you in September. So to those that are joining, just to wish you a lovely rest of your day, wherever you are in the world. Good evening or good
Yeah.
morning,
Yeah.
and we
Well,
hope to
good
see you
evening.
soon.
Thank
All right
you.
then.
Thanks
Okay,
very
bye
much.
all, and thank you
Take
for your time.
care.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you,
Thank
Nora.
you. Bye.